All right, let's go ahead and get started. We're still talking about some backgrounds to Christianity, and we'll pick up and talk about Judaism. A couple things to keep in mind. First, please try to let me know by the end of the week whether you're going to be doing the Greek presentations, the large presentation, the reflection essays. Try to let me know. Again, you can change. I want you to talk to me about changing so we can figure out what you would need to do. But let me know by the end of this week if you possibly can. Second thing, the first reading quiz will be this week. On Canvas, under modules, there is a document that says key things to know, and it's broken up by quiz. And so that way you can kind of focus on those things as you prepare for the reading quiz. So that's key things to know under modules on Canvas. So keep that in mind. Any questions, anything we need to discuss about any of the requirements or anything? One last thing, don't forget our group discussion on Wednesday this week. We'll do a group discussion as opposed to a debate. The relationship between Christianity and philosophy. So again, we're going to be focusing start off by talking about the way Christians approached Greek philosophy, and we'll talk a little bit about Greek philosophy today, and then broaden it out into a larger contemporary context. But be thinking about how should Christians respond to the ideas of the world, the philosophy of the world? Are there places where we can say, well, this is like what we believe as Christians, to use a place to build bridges, or should we kind of completely abandon, say, no, we shouldn't use that because it's not Christian. So think about that for Wednesday. Today we'll start off by talking about some things in Jewish culture, and then we'll be moving into talking about some Jewish beliefs, some Greek and Roman beliefs that were in existence in the culture at the time of the first century. One of the major things I want to start off with is talking about the different Jewish groups or the different Jewish sects that were in the culture of the time, because there were a variety of approaches to Judaism. There were some things that were similar. Right? The belief that Israel, Jews were a special people, that there was one God, the importance of the law. So there were some things across these groups that was the same, but there were quite a few differences as well. So one of the major groups was the Pharisees. What do you know about the Pharisees?
They were kind of like the leaders in a way. Like a lot of people looked up to them as being like the example.
Okay, so they did have some influence, some religious leadership. What else?
Highly educated.
Right, they spent a lot of effort in education, particularly education in the law. What else?
Very few amount of, so like not a lot of people want to actually do this. They're very elite group.
Yeah, there was certainly an elitism to them. Probably a lot of people kind of followed after them, but as far as how they were looked at. Anything else that you know about with respect to the Pharisees?
Well, they hated Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, one of Jesus' major opponents were the Pharisees. And so that he found himself in conflict with them quite a bit, even though in many respects, the way that they looked at the law, looked at God, was similar to how Jesus talked about God, but there were some other things that the Pharisees considered to be pretty important that that led to the conflict between them. Anything else you can think of? In many respects, the Pharisees, we look at them fairly negatively. Understandably so. I mean, a lot of the condemnation that Jesus gives the Pharisees is their legalism, which led to hypocrisy. But a lot of that came from, their attention to the law, their attention to purity. Another group that was also prominent around the time of the first century were the Sadducees. What do you know about the Sadducees?
They didn't believe in the resurrection.
All right, so they didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. What else?
They're one of the two groups, all the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin.
Okay, so the Jewish court at the time, Sanhedrin, was made up of Pharisees and Sadducees. Paul starts a little bit of a conflict in the book of Acts by asserting that he's brought before them, having been arrested, and he said, "I'm a Pharisee. I'm on trial for believing what our fathers promised." And all of a sudden, the Pharisees are like, "We don't really see any problem with this guy," and the Sadducees are like, "All right." So they work together on the Sanhedrin, but were in conflict about a lot of things. We don't know much about the Sadducees, other than, the conflict. They were on the Sanhedrin, they didn't believe in spirits, they didn't really believe much in an afterlife, because we only know about them from the New Testament and a couple of other writings of people that were against the Sadducees, right? There's no positive things said about the Sadducees in Scripture. So we don't really know from their own words how they view these things. They only believed that the 5 books of Moses were Scripture. They didn't really hold to the rest of what we call the Old Testament. They didn't really see that as authoritative. Largely, they were the aristocrats. They were the ones in the higher positions. They were the priests. A lot of the priests were Sadducees. A lot of the people in power were Sadducees. But like I said, not much known beyond that. The Essenes might not be a group that you've heard too much about, but does anybody know much of anything about the Essenes? They were a much smaller group. A lot of them lived out in the wilderness, separated themselves from the rest of Jewish society. If you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is the group that is believed to have been the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were a very intense group. There was a waiting period to become a member, so if you wanted to become a member of one of their communities, you had to wait for a certain time. You had to participate in kind of a probationary period. They practiced some very strict discipline, lived out in the wilderness, engaged in some water purification rituals, right? Baptism was a part of, immersion was a part of being an Essene. So lived out in the wilderness, very strict, interest in immersion. Does that sound like anybody you know?
Yeah, some believe John was an Essene.
Yeah, some people suggest maybe John the Baptist had some influence from the Essenes, right? He lived out in the wilderness. There's no clear indication of that, and certainly John is going a different direction than what the Essenes do. But, there's some similarities there. They actually believed kind of in 2 messiahs. They believed in a priestly Messiah and kind of the more kingly Messiah, a teacher of righteousness. Here too, not much that we know because they kind of went out into the wilderness, but the Dead Sea Scrolls do give us some information about their community, because not only were there copies of Scripture found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but there were a lot of community regulations that were found as well. The last major group at the time was more of a political group than a religious group, and that was the Zealots. Do you know anything about the Zealots?
Weren't they like kind of radical?
Yeah, they were radical. They were a very radical group, but much more politically radical.
The apostle was one.
Right, one of the apostles, Simon the Zealot, which, you probably had this pointed out to you before, would have been a very difficult position for the apostles, because you had Matthew the tax collector, who's basically siding with Rome. Right? He's all in with Rome, And then you have Simon the Zealot, who is interested in, violent, militaristic overthrow of Rome. And yet somehow Jesus brings them together, they work together, but the Zealots very much more of a militaristic, political type of approach than necessarily religious. Questions or comments about any of those groups? A couple other things to talk about with respect to what Jewish culture was like. Much of Jewish culture, or much of Jews, lived outside of Judea, Palestine, in what's known as the diaspora, which is the word means dispersion. Under Greek and Roman rule, and even before that, Jews were dispersed throughout the Roman Empire. Probably about 2/3 of them lived outside of Judea.
I have a question about this. Like those 4 sects, were they all like at the same time?
Yeah, there were elements of all 4 of those that lived around that first century time, somewhat before, somewhat after. Appears like after the destruction of the Second Temple, the Zealots will eventually kind of die out. Well, mostly because Rome will kill them. So that'll die out. The Essenes die out, and the Sadducees, as a political party, die out. So what becomes Judaism after the destruction of the Second Temple is mostly shaped by the Pharisees. Other questions about the sects before we? It's estimated somewhere between 3 to 8 million Jews lived in the Roman Empire. That's not that much smaller than how many Jews there are worldwide today, which shows you how much of an impact not only the Holocaust had, but a couple of other things like the Holocaust, not to that scale. It led to not a huge rise in the population of Jews since the time of the Roman Empire. Some of that is related to the question of, all right, you live in the diaspora, people begin to intermarry. Right? Acts 16, we're told Timothy has a Jewish mother but a Gentile father. Right? So it's happening where Jews and Gentiles are getting married. Certainly once Christianity spreads, you'll see more of that. But who counts as a Jew? All right, is a question that will plague Judaism even up till today. For a time it was if you had a Jewish mother, you were Jewish. But now it can be either parent for a lot of Jews. But even back then, there was a question of, right, who is a Jew? Many Greeks and Romans looked at Jews very negatively. They did not have a high opinion of Jews. A lot of Greeks and Romans looked down on people from the eastern part of the Roman Empire anyway. So it wasn't just Jews, but that was something as well. They often considered their customs and their religion very, very strange. And they were also very resentful at times about the position that Jews had religiously. They were allowed the free exercise of their religion. In many cases, when especially the Romans conquered an area, they approached the people in the sense of, okay, you can continue to worship your gods as long as you worship all of our gods as well. All right, so you kind of have to accept everybody. And the Jews, of course, monotheistic, wouldn't do that, led to a lot of conflicts, and so eventually Rome gave them a rather privileged position. They were one group that could continue to, all right, you just worship your God, and you don't have to worship the rest of the gods. Which gave Christianity some privileged position as well in the early goings. Because as long as Rome looked at Christianity as just a group within Judaism, all right, you just worship your one God. But toward the end of the first century, when more Gentiles are joining and fewer Jews are joining, it becomes to be looked at as something different. Right? This isn't a Jewish religion. This is a new religion, which is a problem. So that's why you begin to see more persecution rising in the 2nd, 3rd century because of the difference. They were allowed the use of their own law. They were exempt from a variety of other things like military service. Some Jews did manage to get into the Roman government, participate in higher parts of Roman society. We mentioned Herod briefly. In Acts, Paul talks about Governor Felix. His wife, Drusilla, was Jewish. Right? So there are some other cases where Jews did make it into higher parts of Roman life. A couple other things, more switching now towards Jewish religion, Jewish teaching at this point. This period we refer to as Second Temple Judaism. This is the time period of roughly 515 BC to AD 70. After coming back from Babylonian exile, recreation of the Second Temple, which of course is destroyed in AD 70. There are a couple themes of this Second Temple Judaism that mark it distinct from early versions of Israelite worship. One is the importance of individual responsibility and righteousness. If you think about religion as it's expressed in particularly 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, a lot of emphasis is put on collective, right? If the king goes bad, the people are going bad, right? So there's a lot of focus on collective righteousness, collective responsibility. But when you look at some of the exilic prophets, Ezekiel, Daniel, a lot of the shift is on personal righteousness, right? Even though it's in Moses that the sons should not be killed for the sins of the father, there's much more of that emphasized in like those exilic prophets. And so the emphasis becomes on an individual's ability to be righteous, an individual's responsibility as well. A lot of the focus prior to the Babylonian exile was on the law being about ritual. And so there's guidelines regarding sacrifices, there's guidelines regarding the holidays, the ceremonies. When you don't have a temple, a lot of the Jews shifted for emphasizing the moral, ethical component of the law rather than the ceremonies. I mean, they were still there, obviously. But for a lot of Jews, it became less about ritual and more about a guide to human relationships, how to live your daily life, which sometimes meant reinterpreting some of the laws. For example, there's laws in the Old Testament about how you're supposed to harvest your field. And you're supposed to harvest it in such a way that you leave some for the poor, right? You know, think about the book of Ruth, right? And you're going back in and kind of harvesting. Well, if you're living in a city in the Babylonian Empire, all right, much more urban type of setting, how do you follow that? Well, instead of it being exactly about how you should harvest your field, it became much more about how you should treat the poor. Right? And so more of a, instead of a literalistic interpretation, more of a ethical or moral interpretation. Also, very important through this time period is the hope of the restoring of David's kingdom, right, the concern of the Messiah, which appeared throughout the different types of Judaism. Each of them had a kind of a different view about who that Messiah was supposed to be, how many Messiahs there were going to be. But there's this hope that someone will come like David to restore the kingdom. Also developing in Second Temple Judaism is kind of this continued localized worship. It's at some point in this period that the synagogues develop. We don't know exactly when. Did they develop in exile and kind of continue? Was it after the return? But while the temple is important, worship in the synagogue became very, very important to people. And of course, after the destruction of the Second Temple, this is something that continues on. how was this helpful for the development of early Christianity?
Well, you see that like Paul and other people that went around spreading Christianity usually just started at the synagogue because he knows that's where a lot of the believers in God are. So it's just an easy place to start.
Yeah, I mean, the focus is going to be on taking the message to the Jews first. So having Jews at various places, you know they're going to be there, made it easier for Paul and others to kind of start there. Questions about any of these themes?
I don't know, it might be kind of far off, but I've been studying. So going back to the diaspora, how come, like, when we look at the first, you know what I'm saying? When we track the history of Israel, it was so easy to track, the different falls, you know what I'm saying? The Babylonian, like, we was able to see where the Jews went at the time. But for some reason, the fall of AD 70, it's like history is lost, and then they pop back up. So when I was studying, the reason I asked is because in my study, a lot of the Jews in the fall of AD 70 stayed in the local state, you know what I'm saying, in the local Middle Eastern, the northern Africa, the northern African countries. But then when we look at the Ashkenazi Jews, you study the DNA, and it's like 2% ancient people. So I think the Ashkenazi, the ones in Europe, the majority of them, I think, can track their lineage to like two women. So I asked that because I'm looking, we'll see the church, we'll have movements that aren't based on any knowledge or anything. It's just based on our limited interpretation of the scriptures. So when we see things going on, like between Palestine and Israel, and we're like, oh, I stand with Israel. But when I was studying, a lot of the Palestinians, they're Jew. They have more Jewish blood in them than, you know what I'm saying, the ones that are. So I'm wondering what happened. Why, you know what I'm saying, why is there that disparity when we can go back further and actually track the exact movement of this people?
Yeah, I think that some of it has to do with the banishment from Jews from Judea, that early 2nd century period, which kind of further exacerbates the spread to begin with, and the amount of intermarriage that was taking place. And the question of, okay, with all this intermarriage, how do you determine who's Jewish or who's not? And so it becomes less about a strict, there's still that strict ethnic, genetic line, heritage line, but it becomes more about some different things as well. And so, that I think has a big part in, some of those differences that you're pointing to. Which makes the conflict between the Palestinians and the Jews, or the Israelis, I should say, it's a very difficult position to take. Well, I support this or I support that. I'm like, well, there's kind of each group kind of has some good points that they're making about why they should be, a part of that land, or why that land should be theirs. That, a lot of us that are looking from the outside might just say, hey, just make 2 states, which might solve the problem. Well, for them, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Yeah, and so it becomes very complex because there's, so many different historical things going on in all of that. But, makes it really complicated, and the lack of a clear historical record in some spots, it further complicates us for trying to understand.
I think a lot of our minds are going to be blown when Christ returns, simply because we know that they're going to accept Christ. There's a remnant that's going to accept Christ as Savior. So I just think, I don't know. It's just trying to study that is just so like you said, there's so much that goes into it, and it's so difficult. So.
Yeah, and it's one of those things of, as a contemporary Christian today, there is certainly a place for respecting and recognizing a common faith heritage with Jews and respecting their devotion to God. Yet also, how do we say, okay, I respect you, I respect what, you know, and I understand and certainly want to take very seriously what has happened to Jews because they were Jews with like the Holocaust, but yet I also know that they need to be called to Christ as well, and how the centuries of the problems between Christians and Jews and some of the things Christians have done to Jews. It's just a very, very complex picture that I don't think God intended. I think God was, you know, the intent was that, you know, I mean, you look at all of these things, right? That's from a Christian standpoint, we're saying, well, that's all leading people to what Christ is going to teach, right? It doesn't obviously doesn't work that way in a very easy manner. Other questions or comments, thoughts about what we're seeing here?
These people held to a Davidic restoration after AD 70?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 when we talked about that on Friday, and they thought he was the Messiah. And even as late as the 1990s, there was a group of Jews in New York City. They are Hasidic Jews. Hasidic Judaism develops in the 18th century, and it has to do with pursuit of joy and some other things related to the law. If you've ever seen pictures or been in New York and seen Jews wearing the long black coats, the furry hats, they have the hair locks coming down, most likely those are Hasidic Jews. Well, there is a group of Hasidic Jews known as Lubavitchers, and they come from a city in Eastern Europe, Lubavitch. And their leader, 1990s, an 80-year-old man, they believed he was the Messiah. And when he died, many of them thought he was going to be brought back to life. And people claim that they received messages from him after the great, right? So, I mean, there's still people today expecting a Messiah. There are some Jews today, the largest group of Jews known as Reform Jews, who believe that there's a messianic age coming, but they don't believe there's an actual Messiah, like there's not going to be a person coming. There's still that hope among some groups, and other groups have kind of reinterpreted some of those passages from the Jewish Bible that talk about, you know, restoration, Davidic hope, those kind of things. Other questions or comments? Let's switch and talk about some things related to Greek and Roman religion. Some of the things that, you know, obviously there's quite a bit of difference between these groups. One of those being polytheism versus monotheism. Deities, of course, worship of deities was very important in Greek and Roman religion. The deities, you know, if you've read any of the myths, know much about those Greek and Roman myths, they mirrored human beings in a lot of different ways. They got married, they had a variety of human emotions. But basically, for Greek and Roman life, you needed the gods on your side, or you needed to kind of assuage the anger of the deities. And so a lot of Roman religion was about trying to convince the deities to be on your side. And so you engaged in a variety of practices, sacrifices, those kind of things, in order to get them on your side. There was a belief in existence after death. Right? You know, at death, you went to the underworld. There was a place where you were kind of could be punished if you lived an evil life, or a place of like Hades was that realm. The Elysian Fields, a place of reward. A lot of attention in Greek and Roman religion was on the belief that the soul was immortal. That we had an immortal soul that was going to live on after death. There was not a belief in resurrection. Right? That the soul was going to be rejoined with the body and have an existence after death. And so there was quite some differences there between particularly Christianity and Roman religion, but even to Jewish religion as well. A lot of the focus in religion was on what the experts could do for you, right? The priests. So if you wanted to participate in religion, you had to involve the priest. Many cases it wasn't an individual privatized. I mean, there was some of that, but a lot of the focus was on priests. Also very important was keeping the traditions, the customs of the ancestors, not quite to the point of ancestor worship, like what we might see in something like in ancient China or something else in East Asia, but there was still a lot of respect and honor of the religion of the ancestors that was very important. And so a lot of Roman religion revolved around these kind of things, very collective type of approach. There was some places for individual worship, but it was mainly about groups. Religion as celebrated as a family. Religion celebrated as a city, perhaps even to the level of the empire. So if you think about this, right, this is the status of religion in the Roman Empire, 1st century, 2nd century. Here you come as a Christian. Why would Christianity be looked upon very suspiciously? Why would there be such a concern for Christianity in a system like this? Adrian?
Because of the belief in one God. So you say one God, and I've got all these deities, then you automatically you negate every single thing that I believe.
Yeah, I mean, if you're kind of in a situation, all right, where you believe there's all these gods, and you're asking me to give up all of them and worship this one God, I mean, that's a big shift in thinking. How else was it?
So there's just kind of like a lot of differences to what they think is like the important part, and I guess like their afterlife look is different. The experts thing is different than Christianity, and I don't know. It's just it'd be a big difference. So they wouldn't change this.
Yeah, something just like the afterlife, right? It's like, okay, I believe that there's existence after death, but you're telling me that the soul and the body are going to rejoin? And there's going to be that kind of it? No. The soul is this is what happens to you're asked to kind of make some big changes in what you believe, and afterlife being just one example of that. How might Christianity have been problematic from a social standpoint, right? You're looking at what's Christianity going to do to our society?
Shoot, you got the entrance where Paul was ran out, I forgot the name, that would sell the statues, and then just what Paul was teaching, that was hindering his business.
Right, yeah, so there's the economic impact of, here's Demetrius selling, he's selling the silver statues of Artemis in Ephesus, and so he could lose his business. Why else is it problematic?
People aren't really eating and purchasing meat sacrificed to idols.
Right? I mean, yeah, there's other things like, the meats offered to idols, a lot of social organizations like a trade guild, right? Like you were a leather worker and you were part of the leather worker trade guild. Well, the guild would meet in the temple of whatever patron deity, right? And you would have these meals, right? And well, as a Christian, I can't do that, right? So there's that thing, and when food was offered to the deity, some of it was offered in the sacrifices, some of it went to the meat market. Well, Paul has several chapters in 1 Corinthians to talk about, hey, what's the Christian's relationship to something like that? Can I eat it? Well, you can eat it if it's sold in the market, that's fine, but don't go to the temple and eat it in a sacrifice there. I think another thing here as well is, if you think about this in this corporate worship, right, in this idea of here we are as a city, and like Ephesus, right, and we worship Artemis, Diana. And here you are teaching this other god. Well, Artemis is going to be very, very upset with us if you get, so it's like you're kind of disturbing the peace of the city. Right? So there's the problem of, you're bringing civil unrest as well, right? So Christianity, in this system, there was so much Christianity challenged, both from a religious standpoint and a political standpoint and a social standpoint, that was concerning to a lot of Romans.
I think also religiously, they had to completely change. Supposedly they were to accept Christianity, obviously. They had to completely change how they viewed their relationship with God. Granted, sometimes God gets mad and justly punishes, but it's always just and righteous punishment, as opposed to, oh, well, he's just mad because this other God said something to him, and now he's going to destroy all of our crops.
Yeah.
So they're walking on glass, while our God's let me be just and righteous in my judgment.
Yeah, that's a very good point, right? That when God acts, he always acts justly. The Greek and Roman gods, they could get upset about something minor, and yet, here's a blight on your crops for years. Because, his breakfast wasn't that great. So yeah, it was a very different way of thinking about God. Nick.
I think another thing is Christianity in this time would break down so many social barriers that there were, not only just between Jews and Gentiles or whatever was happening, but with even slaves and slave owners, we see in Philemon is if you're all brothers in Christ, then you're all on the same playing field, and so that's just going to be really difficult for any sort of status quo or social order of the time.
Yeah, and when you look at some of the things that 2nd and 3rd century pagan authors wrote about Christians, it was you look at all the women and children and slaves in this religion, right? And then, that was a bad thing. We would say, hey, that's a good thing that it's bringing in all sorts of people, but they're look at all those people that are becoming parts of Christianity.
Especially when you have Pharisees and stuff that are elite, and those are seen as the most holy. But then when Jesus comes, he's healer of the broken, and the healer of the ones that need to be healed, not the elite. So
yeah, it's the younger brother, older brother of the prodigal son, right? The younger brother recognizing that the older brother having some resentment. Check.
Was circumcision really pushed in early Christianity on the Greeks?
There were, at least what we get from the New Testament, there were some groups going around that were Christian, right? They accepted Jesus as Messiah, but that still wanted to have, hold on to some aspects of the law of Moses. That's part of what the Jerusalem Conference is. But I'm not sure how widespread that was. It was certainly something that Paul continually came up against. But whether that was something that, it doesn't seem like it was that prevalent where that was something the Romans were like, hey, the Jews want us to be circumcised, but the Christians want us to be circumcised. Another aspect of Greek and Roman life was philosophy and the impact of philosophy. Remember, as we talked about on Friday, religion was just focused on the gods and relationships with the god. Philosophy was where people turned to, for how do I live my life? And in general, of course, philosophy is being watered down to the common people. Not many people had time to spend on philosophy. But that's where the people got direction, was more from how to live. Philosophy was where moral advice came from, right? You don't go to the priest to discuss the nature of reality or what the good life is. You go to the philosopher. A lot of philosophy at the time was focused on ethics. What's the ethical way to live? What is the ground for ethics? Right living, right action. Those were the kind of things that philosophers emphasized, not priests. Eventually, a lot of the teachings of philosophers developed into philosophical schools. Again, not as much of a distinction for the common person in the Greek and Roman world, but you have these various philosophical schools that propagated the philosophers' teachings. There were a couple of those that were important for early Christianity. We'll briefly touch on them. One of the major ones that shaped early Christianity was Platonism, after Plato. Of course, Plato propagating the teachings of Socrates. One idea from Plato that gains a lot of currency in Christianity is the doctrine of the immortal soul. Right? Scripture doesn't really teach the immortality of the soul. It teaches the resurrection of the body. Yet, probably if you went up to most Christians and asked, do you believe you have an immortal soul? They would say, yes. Why? Platonism has had that much of an impact on Christian doctrine through the centuries. And so immortality of the soul is something that has become a part of that. For Plato, the soul existed prior to physical life and continues after death, and was something very, very distinct from the body. Plato was also important for early Christians because of his criticism of the ancient gods, very critical about the way the gods acted. And many early Christians picked up on some of his arguments against the Greek and Roman gods and used them against Greek and Roman contemporaries. So, as they would, accuse Christians of things, Christians would use the arguments, the claims of Plato to say, well, hey, even your own philosophers say this about the gods. Several philosophers did promote a monotheism. Plato was one of those. Often, a lot of the one God of philosophers was one that was very separate from the world, wasn't very involved in the world. So they were kind of monotheistic, but they weren't it wasn't the same thing that Jews and Christians talk about. One of the other key components of Plato's philosophy was the world of forms. So this view that there was another world that had the ideals of society. So in the world of forms, there existed an ideal circle. And that was a perfect circle. And so there were things like that existed in the world of forms that were mirrored in the physical realm. And so for Christians, some of them felt that this is a good way for us to talk about the afterlife, right? There's this other world, this perfect world. Now again, some of this we'll talk about on Wednesday. All right, does this really tell us what heaven's like, right? Or is this, does this complicate that? So Platonism was one important philosophical school. Stoicism was another. It was founded by a man named Zeno of Cyprus. Had a very high morality, very strict morality. And for Stoics, the goal of life was to live a virtuous life. Zeno and other Stoics talked about a law being in nature, a rational principle that pervades the universe. Quote, people should live according to this reason, or the Greek word logos. All right, so there was this idea of the logos, universal reason that existed in Stoicism and others. And so to live this way is to live according to the law of nature. And so this logos principle was a way for Christians to connect to Jesus being the Logos of God, John 1, and Greek philosophy, right? Your Greek philosophy is talking about the Logos, we're talking about the Logos. Well, the Greek Logos and Jesus is the Logos don't mean quite the same thing, right? But there were attempts to do that. The Stoics didn't really have much stock for emotion. I mean, it wasn't like they completely downplayed it, but reason was much more important. And so to take something stoically means to take it without emotion. So reason was very important for the Stoics. But they did not have a personal God, at least in the ideas of what Christians and Jews talked about. It was more of an impersonal God, pantheism, right? A God that kind of permeates the universe. The last philosophical school to talk about is Epicureanism, started by a man named Epicurus. If you remember Acts 17, the two schools that Paul kind of encounters at Mars Hill, the Areopagus, is the Epicureans and the Stoics. All right, so there's a connection there in Acts 17. There was no purpose to creation for the Epicureans. The world, the universe, it was eternal, and it ultimately had no purpose. It always had existed, and only the material world existed for the Epicureans, which meant that even if there were gods, they were a part of creation as well. And so Epicureans believed that reality, the universe, was made up of indestructible atoms, right? They're kind of the precursor of what we think and where we get the idea of atoms, or not the idea, but the word atoms. So the gods were made up of atoms as well. And so they had a physical existence. The gods lived outside this world and basically had no contact with it. For the Epicureans, there was no need for prayer. There was no need for ritual. In fact, some Epicureans believed that to pray to the gods would disturb the gods. All right, so a very different view. The Epicureans believed that pleasure was the goal of life. Not a hedonism, not just do whatever you want, but pleasure, particularly the tranquility of the soul, is what you should look for. Now, certainly some Epicureans took that to, hey, do whatever feels good, that kind of idea. But ultimately, there's no future life. Right? There's nothing after this life. The physical life is all exists. Now, there was an idea of the soul, but it was physical too. So when the body died, the soul died as well. Which meant there was nothing to fear in death because there's no future punishment. Right? Once you die, you die. That's it. There's no punishment for the life that you live. Questions about any of these Greek philosophies that we've talked about, or any of the things we've talked about?
So they weren't necessarily atheists. They just thought that the material world is bigger than God.
Yeah, in a sense that the gods were just as much a part of the material existence as human beings were. They were different, but they're still material beings. And if the universe has always existed, they weren't responsible for the creation of the universe either. Other questions or comments? All right, so on Wednesday, we will spend some time talking about, okay, here are these philosophies, these Greek philosophies that are in existence, in the culture of the world. Can you use them, as a Christian, can you use them to build bridges? By saying, hey, we agree with you about this, or hey, we